they've been forced to conform since time immemorial, that say something about how they dealt with that, how they fought, how they freed themselves, sometimes loudly, sometimes quietly, how they always found, or at least tried to find, a way to be themselves. That some of those objects would, of course, make reference to a particular woman and the influence she had, but not all of them. Because this wasn't going to be a book about the 100 coolest women in history, but a cabinet of curiosities showing how rich and diverse, how complex and non-linear the history of all women is. No, before I could say any of that, an elderly gent brayed loudly. Women and objects, but women are objects. A stupid line, crude and not at all funny. But underneath, it does hint at something. At the fact that history has so often been narrated as though this comment were true. As though, for most of it, women really did have about as little influence or significance as a vase you'd put on display in the corner and occasionally fill with something, a baby. Even today, with inspirational women and their stories being pulled out of oblivion, it can sometimes sound as though active thinking, fighting, storytelling, tightrope walking women are something quite new. As though, with a couple of notable exceptions, all those who came before us were asleep, mere onlookers. As though their story is largely one of passive victims. None of that is true. None of that has ever been true. At least not in the way we usually tell it. Women have always been there and they have always contributed. The objects for which they were so often mistaken and with which they shared the domains, the personal and the public too, bear witness to this side of history that has so long been overlooked, so often ignored or dismissed as insignificant, irrelevant, trivial. These objects don't reference drum-beating, big-picture history, at least not always, but point instead to details and anecdotes, to things that only gained in importance over time and with great perseverance. They narrate the world in a different way. Some can be set within a larger context, some played a role at a very specific moment, some speak to a wider tendency, still others of one particular woman whose story I didn't want to omit. Because this collection of objects is absolutely subjective. It wasn't curated by a historian, but by a woman who grew up between France and Germany at the end of the 20th century. A woman who loves women, their objects and their stories. A collection chosen by a woman who has a penchant for the unimportant and anecdotal, and who enjoys taking imaginary walks through the distant past. The focus here is on the history of women of the Western Hemisphere, not out of any lack of interest in the rest of the world, but, on the contrary, because it would have seemed to me dishonest to extend this intuitive, subjective approach to cultures with which I am unfamiliar such that I could not do them justice. A history of women in 101 objects extends through the past like a long hallway along which, here and there, I open a door or pull something down off a shelf to shed light on certain aspects of history or tell a particular story. There are 101 objects here, but there could just as well have been 200, 300, 1,000. It was hard to place a limit. Because the history of women and their objects is unbelievably rich, so much richer than you might think. It is manifold and sometimes sad, often insanely amusing. Sometimes it makes you want to shout for joy to see how strong and resourceful and wily women have always been, how close even our most distant relatives are to us, how similar our thoughts, concerns and ambitions despite all that separates us. This history of women is neither exhaustive nor definitive, but nor does it want to be. Above all, it hopes to inspire you to dig deeper, to get things down from the shelves of history, to look for details and anecdotes and all those supposedly irrelevant matters, and to find in them material links to a world still far too unknown to us, the world that belongs to the women of history. Annabelle Hirsch.